Did you ever have to pretend everything was fine when it really wasn't?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, at my own son's award ceremony, he stood on that stage, with a microphone in his hand and his classmates and their families sitting all around, and he looked right at me and said I did not deserve to celebrate him because I was never there. The applause in the room kept going, but for me, it was like someone had pulled the floor out from under my chair. I clapped politely, the way you do for a stranger's kid, because I knew if I didn't, people would stare. I smiled like nothing happened, but inside, I was replaying every late night I worked double shifts, every time I drove across town in traffic just to drop him off at practice, every single bill I quietly paid while his father played the victim. What no one saw, and what my son certainly didn't bother to mention, was that I had been funding his future since he was in middle school. I opened a college fund early, deposited money every single month, even when rent and utilities left me barely breathing. I was the one who paid for the tutoring sessions he bragged about on his scholarship applications, the extra training camps, the uniforms, the travel fees. His father showed up for pictures and speeches, while I showed up at the bank with my debit card. Do you know why no one knew? Because I thought silence was strength. I thought letting him have his hero in the spotlight was worth me being in the shadows. So when he said those words, "You were never there," it was like years of swallowing my pride finally hit a wall. I didn't storm out, I didn't correct him, and I didn't confront his father who sat 2 rows behind me with that smug look like he had coached our son to deliver the perfect performance. I just clapped. I smiled. And then I planned. That night, while everyone was celebrating with cake and photos, I logged into the account I had been growing for almost a decade. I saw the balance, I saw the sacrifices in numbers, and I hit close. I left one simple note that would greet him in the morning: work for it. I knew it would crush him, but I also knew it was time he learned what it actually means to value something. The next morning, my phone buzzed nonstop. Dozens of missed calls, voicemails from my son's shaky voice begging me to pick up, and furious texts from his father accusing me of ruining Ethan's future. He deserved that fund, Mark wrote, as if he had put in a single dollar. I didn't answer. Not one word. For the first time, I understood the power of silence, not as weakness, but as the strongest move I could make. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about stopping the cycle where I did everything quietly, only for them to pretend I was never there. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to defend myself. I was going to let the absence of my money speak louder than my words ever had. And yet, deep down, I wasn't sure if I could stick to it. A part of me wanted to cave, to call him back, to explain everything, to dump the receipts of every payment on the table. But then I thought about the smirk on his father's face at that ceremony, the way he leaned back like he had won some battle I never agreed to fight. I thought about how my son, my own child, had repeated his father's line word for word without ever asking me for my side. That was the moment I knew explaining would do nothing. Proof would come, but not from me trying to beg them to believe me. I looked at the folder I had kept over the years, labeled proof, full of bank statements, contracts, and canceled checks. I didn't send it. Not yet. Because this wasn't about dumping evidence in anger. This was about letting him experience what happens when the safety net he thought was automatic disappears overnight. By noon that day, he left me a message that hit harder than the ceremony speech. "Mom, you ruined my future." Not, "Mom, I'm sorry." Not, "Mom, tell me your side." Just blame. Just entitlement. And behind his voice, I could hear his father feeding the lines. I closed my eyes, set the phone face down, and finally allowed myself to laugh, not because it was funny, but because after years of being painted invisible, I had just taken the first step to show them I was never gone. They just weren't looking. And the best part? They hadn't even seen the rest of the plan. By the time the first wave of messages slowed and the righteous speeches from my ex dried up, I had already decided that I would not be dragged back into the old pattern where I answered accusations with explanations and then paid to make the tension disappear. Because that script had kept me small and quiet and funded a reality where other people narrated my life for me, so instead I took a long breath, drank cold coffee that tasted like every tired morning of the past decade, and opened the folder on my laptop that I had named in a moment of exhausted humor as proof, which held years of bank statements, tuition invoices, camp registrations, travel receipts, counselor bills, and a tidy spreadsheet where every transfer into the college fund sat next to the date and the category and the little note I wrote to myself to keep going. I knew that if I threw all of this at my son in one angry dump, it would land like an attack and be used against me by the man who trained him to believe that volume equals truth. So I chose a different route and scheduled a short meeting with the guidance office. Because while social media likes a performance, paperwork respects documentation, and when you correct the record in the places that actually move money and make determinations, you do not need applause to get results. Ms. Patel greeted me with the kind of calm that makes people feel seen without being indulged, and when I told her that my son had made a public claim that I was never there while the other parent had been posing as the sole provider, she did not ask for gossip. She asked for dates and documents, which I handed over without commentary, and as she flipped through the statements and matched them to the enrichment programs and testing fees listed on his scholarship forms, she nodded in that quiet way that says this is not the first time a mother has been written out of her own labor. And then she said something that stayed with me all day, that records must match reality when public money is involved, and that she would make sure the relevant committees had accurate information before final award decisions were locked. I did not ask her to punish anyone, I did not tell her the humbling words said into a microphone, and I did not beg for sympathy, because I have learned the hard way that begging buys resentment, while accuracy buys clarity. And clarity is the one thing that makes manipulators nervous, so I signed the release allowing the school to reference my contributions where appropriate. I updated the contact list so that calls about finances came to me and not to a voicemail that never returned them, and I left the office lighter than I had felt in years, even though I knew a storm was walking toward me with my ex's name written right in the center. On my way out, I allowed myself one strategic message, not to my son who was still marinating in the narrative that I had ruined everything, but to the scholarship committee inbox listed on the school portal. A simple note that included a brief correction about who had paid for which programs and when, supported by a neat set of attachments, and one line that explained I did not seek to change any merit evaluation, only to ensure the financial need portion reflected the truth so that the award would not be based on a story but on verifiable facts, because if the system was going to judge us, it should judge what actually happened. Back at home, my sister Rosa sat at my table like she had been waiting for this day since the first time I cried after a parent night that Mark had turned into his personal stage, and she told me her mantra again, the one she repeats when I start to waffle, that I should call it and not warn it, which means act first and explain later, and that line wrapped itself around my spine like armor, so when Mark posted a triumphant photo of Ethan's trophy with a caption framing himself as the solo parent who never missed a practice and carried the weight alone, I did not respond. I did not correct him in public, and I did not send a single receipt. I simply watched the comments roll in and felt the old urge to defend Di a little more. Late that afternoon, Ms. Patel sent me a short email that did not read like a victory dance and did not promise anything dramatic, but it said the committee had received my documents, that certain entries on applications would be updated to reflect actual sources of payment, and that there might be adjustments before final letters went out, and those two words, there might, were better than fireworks because they meant the process had started and that I no longer needed to shout across a room to be heard. I had placed truth where truth could do work. The calls from my son turned into shorter, sharper bursts, less begging and more accusation, his voice coached into righteous anger by a man who thrives on how things look rather than what they are. And when I didn't answer, he left a message that tried to shame me into compliance by invoking family and pride and the imaginary version of motherhood, where your worth equals your willingness to be erased. And I swear I could feel the long seam of my patience finally stitch itself shut, because I realized the only person I had to convince was myself, and that work had already been done. By evening, the house was quiet, the folder on my desktop was closed, and the account remained shut with that one line that had lit a fuse I intended to see through, and as I set my phone to do not disturb, a new notification slid across the screen from the guidance counselor again, Not a form this time, not a rule, just a single sentence that landed like the sound of a lock turning in the right direction, telling me that the committee would be asking both parents to submit confirmations for any claimed payments before dispersing funds, which meant the next questions would not be mine to ask, and that soon, someone else would be looking at the same pages I had carried for years. When the email from the scholarship office arrived 2 days later, it was written in the kind of restrained language that only bureaucrats can craft, full of phrases like pending review, awaiting clarification, and subject to adjustment. But underneath the careful wording sat the weight of something undeniable. The story that had been presented by my ex as the single version of reality was now fractured, and the people who controlled the awards that my son had been bragging about were asking for receipts. The committee was not content with general claims of who sacrificed what. They wanted specific documentation of payments made for summer programs, training camps, tutoring sessions, and test preparation. And they made it clear that failure to produce verifiable evidence would result in recalculated eligibility. I sat at my desk staring at the lines, and for the first time in years, I felt no pressure to rush in and fix anything with explanations or apologies, because the weight had shifted away from me and landed exactly where it belonged, on the shoulders of a man who had been narrating my absence while living off the fruits of my silence. Mark had always been loud, and his volume had carried him through countless social gatherings, convincing relatives and neighbors that he was the parent who showed up, the parent who carried the weight, the parent who deserved the praise. But volume cannot produce receipts, and charm cannot stand in for canceled checks, so I knew that when he opened that same email, the panic would bloom in his chest before he even reached the second paragraph. My phone rang that evening, not with the stuttering anger of my son, but with the sharp, clipped tone of a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was rotting. He demanded to know what I had done, what I had sent, why I had meddled with things that were already set. He accused me of sabotaging Ethan's future, of trying to humiliate them both, and of dragging private matters into the public. I listened, because I wanted to hear him sweat, and then I hung up without a single word, because what good was there in explaining to someone who had spent years twisting explanations into new accusations? By the next morning, Ethan appeared at my door, not with rage this time, but with confusion that looked almost fragile, his voice breaking as he asked me if it was true that I had been the one paying for everything all along. I wanted to snap, to shout back every sleepless night I had worked overtime just so he could attend the programs that now decorated his resume, but instead I opened a drawer, pulled out the thick envelope I had been keeping for this exact moment, and slid it across the table. The envelope was labeled custody order and receipts, and inside it was a decade's worth of truth, every deposit into the college fund, every invoice from a camp, every transfer that had left my account and gone directly to his future. I did not open it for him, because this was not about me reciting the past in a desperate attempt to be seen. It was about him deciding whether he was finally ready to look at the truth without his father's script in his ears. He stared at the envelope as though it might burn him, and then he asked me why I had let his father take credit all those years if I had been the one carrying the weight. That question, raw and simple, almost broke me, because the answer was as painful as it was stupid. I had thought it would make life easier for him. I believed that letting him see one consistent, heroic parent would protect him from the confusion of adult bitterness, but in doing so, I had erased myself so thoroughly that when he stood on that stage, he truly believed I had not been there. Silence had not shielded him, it had starved him of the truth. Later that week, another email came, this time from the committee itself, notifying both parents that the merit scholarship portion of Ethan's award remained intact. But the need-based calculation was on hold until verifiable contributions could be confirmed. They requested that both parents submit statements of financial involvement, complete with proof. For me, this was simple. I had years of orderly records. For Mark, it was a demand he could not meet, and for Ethan, it was the first crack in a story he had trusted with his whole heart. When word of the adjustment began to ripple through the school community, Mark's polished facade started to wobble. Because it is one thing to declare yourself the lone hero on social media and quite another to stand in front of a committee with nothing but empty words. The people who had once nodded at his loud boasts began to whisper questions, and those whispers reached Ethan faster than any document ever could. That evening, my son left me a voicemail that sounded less like blame and more like bewilderment. He asked why I had stayed quiet all these years, why I had let things reach this point, and whether I had closed the college fund out of spite or principle. I listened to his voice and heard, for the first time in a long time, not just a teenager parroting his father's anger, but a young man grappling with the possibility that his mother had been present all along. I did not call him back. Not yet. I wanted him to sit with the envelope, to open it when he was ready, and to learn that the truth does not come from who shouts the loudest, but from who shows up consistently, even in silence. And as I set the phone down, I realized that the adjustment was not just about scholarship money or committee letters. It was about the entire story of who had been there and who had only pretended to be. For the first time, the system itself was asking the questions I had never been allowed to ask, and the answers were no longer mine to give, they were his father's to fail at. The silence between me and my son after that envelope exchange lasted longer than I expected, and I could sense that he was torn between the loyalty he felt to his father's story and the nagging doubt that had been planted by the scholarship committee's demand for proof. But I also knew that hesitation was a good sign, because it meant that the certainty he had once carried, the certainty that I had never been there, was beginning to fracture. I gave him space, not because I was uninterested, but because I understood that pushing would make him retreat into the safer lie, and what I needed was for him to come forward on his own terms. When he finally did, late one night, his message was not an apology, not even an admission, but a simple question. If he got a job, would I really match the money he earned for tuition? That message told me everything I needed to know about where he was standing. He wanted to believe that I was still the safety net, that even after the humiliation of hearing me accused of absence in front of strangers, I would simply fall back into the old role of paying silently and letting him think he had solved his problems. And I could have given in, I could have opened the account again and covered his tuition in full, and for a moment the thought almost tempted me, because I am his mother, and watching your child struggle cuts deeper than anything else. But then I remembered Rosa's words about calling it instead of warning it, and I remembered the feeling of clapping politely while my own child erased me in public, and I knew I could not return to silence. So I set conditions, not as punishment but as boundaries that should have existed years ago. I told him clearly, if you work, I will match every verified dollar you earn, but you will have to take a financial literacy course offered online through the local community center. And you will also attend at least one counseling session where a professional can walk you through the damage that comes from parents poisoning children with half-truths. I told him I was not going to bankroll disrespect anymore, that effort and accountability had to be part of the equation, and that the days of me quietly funding his future while others took the credit were over. He didn't take it well. At first, he argued that his father had promised him there was another option, that a sponsor connected to one of the booster parents was willing to step in and help if I refused. I almost laughed, because I knew that no sponsor in their right mind would risk attaching themselves to a financial story that was already under review by a scholarship committee, but I held my tongue and said nothing, because letting him believe in that fantasy for a few days would teach him more than any lecture from me ever could. I also knew that Rosa had a way of getting information into the right ears, and it didn't take long before that booster parent started to back away, not with accusations or public drama, but with the quiet avoidance that happens when risk outweighs benefit. Mark, of course, exploded. He called me in a rage, accusing me of manipulating our son and undermining the opportunities he had worked so hard to secure. But the hollowness of his words was more obvious now, because every time he claimed to have sacrificed, someone asked him for proof, and every time he promised that sponsors would step in, the supposed benefactors disappeared before their names were even written down. His voice, once so confident and commanding, had started to sound desperate, and that desperation told me more than any argument ever could. He was losing control of the narrative, and without control of the story, he had nothing. Meanwhile, Ethan's resistance began to soften. He didn't apologize, not outright, but he started to ask practical questions about the job market, about how much he might realistically make at a warehouse shift or a cafe, about whether my matching would cover books or just tuition. Every question was a small crack in the wall that had been built between us, and though I knew it wasn't a reconciliation, it was a shift, and shifts are where new foundations can start. I kept my responses short but firm, not lectures, not pleading, just conditions. Show me pay stubs, and I will match them. Finish the course, and the money is released. Go to the session, and the deal holds. I wanted him to see that I was not withdrawing love. I was withdrawing blind funding, and those are not the same thing. For years, love and money had been tangled together in ways that blurred responsibility, but now I was separating them, and in doing so, I was teaching him that respect was not purchased with tuition checks, it was built through accountability. The moment that sealed this stage came one night when he texted me, asking again if I was serious about the matching, and I responded with a single word, yes. That one word was not a bribe, not a plea, not an argument, it was a line in the sand. Either he would step into adulthood and meet me halfway, or he would follow his father down the road of excuses and entitlement. The choice was his, but the rules were mine. As I set the phone down, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't chasing validation, I wasn't scrambling to prove myself, and I wasn't throwing money at problems to keep the peace. I had written terms and conditions for my role in his future, and the satisfaction I felt in holding that line was sharper and cleaner than any victory I had ever won in silence. And though I didn't know yet what decision he would make, I did know this. The next move would not be dictated by lies, because I had made sure the truth was already on record, and sooner or later, he would see that no sponsor, no speech, and no performance could outlast it. The first weeks of summer moved with a kind of tense quiet, as if everyone in the circle knew something had shifted, but no one quite knew how to speak about it, and in that silence I watched my son wrestle with the choice I had laid in front of him. Either believe his father's empty promises of some mysterious sponsor who would appear with money out of thin air, or accept that the only path forward was to work, to earn, and to meet me on the terms I had written. At first, he dragged his feet, sending me texts about how unfair it all was, about how none of his friends had to prove their worth to their parents, about how I was making him pay for mistakes that belonged to adults, but eventually the talk turned into action. Because reality has a way of cutting through entitlement, and when the sponsor story evaporated like smoke in the wind, he walked into a warehouse on the edge of town and signed on for long shifts moving boxes in heat that humbled him. Faster than any lecture could. I kept my distance, not because I didn't care, but because this had to be his journey, not another version of me swooping in to rescue him, and little by little he started to send me pictures of his pay stubs, half proud and half bitter, asking if I was really going to match them, and each time I did exactly what I promised. I logged the numbers, made the transfer into the new trust, and sent him the receipt so he could see it was real. No drama, no extra words, just a consistent reinforcement that effort brought results, and that this was not about punishment, but about responsibility. In the middle of this, he finished the financial literacy course I had required, and though he mocked it at first, calling it boring and obvious, I could tell from the way he asked questions afterward that some of it had lodged deeper than he wanted to admit. He asked about compound interest, about credit scores, about why some kids graduate drowning in loans while others find ways to navigate the system more carefully, and I answered every question patiently. Not as a lecture, but as a conversation between two people finally standing closer to equal footing. When he completed the counseling session, he came out quieter than I had expected, not defensive but reflective. And I knew that hearing a professional outline the damage caused by parental alienation had planted something in him that I could never have forced with my own words. Meanwhile, Mark grew louder and more frantic, cornering Ethan with demands that he pressure me to reopen the original college fund, insisting that I was destroying family unity and humiliating them both, but the words were beginning to lose their grip. Because with every paycheck Ethan cashed and every matched dollar he saw appear in the trust, the old narrative that I was absent started to unravel, replaced by something harder to ignore. tangible proof that I had been there all along, not in speeches or social media posts, but in actual sacrifices that built the foundation he was now standing on. One evening, when Mark showed up at my door to deliver his latest round of accusations, I let him rant until his voice cracked, and then I calmly told him that the money had never disappeared, that I had not burned years of sacrifice out of spite, but that I had simply moved it into a trust controlled by an independent trustee with clear rules. Every dollar Ethan earned would be matched, every requirement completed would release more funds, and every attempt to manipulate or disrespect would pause distributions. I explained that this way, the money could no longer be twisted into a weapon against me, nor could it be squandered under the illusion that it came from nowhere. It was structured, fair, and undeniable, and the control was no longer his to abuse. Ethan was there when I said it, standing behind his father with an expression that shifted slowly from confusion to something closer to relief, because the rules were no longer arbitrary, the terms were not hidden. And for once he could see that I had designed a system where his future depended on his own choices, not on who shouted the loudest. Mark stormed out, cursing under his breath and throwing one last accusation over his shoulder, but his exit felt less like a victory and more like a retreat, because the ground he had stood on for years had been stripped away, and he knew it. After he left, Ethan stayed, and for the first time in months, he sat down at my kitchen table without anger clouding his eyes. He pulled out the envelope I had given him weeks earlier, the one labeled custody order and receipts, and admitted that he had finally opened it, that he had seen in black and white what I had carried alone, and that he didn't know how to reconcile the mother he had accused of being absent with the mother who had been quietly funding everything. I didn't cry, I didn't gloat, I didn't say, "I told you so." I just told him that respect could not be demanded, it had to be built, and that if he wanted a future, he had to work for it, because love and money had been tangled for too long and I was done letting sacrifice be mistaken for invisibility. When his first match disbursement came through, he showed me the notification on his phone like a kid holding up a report card, and in that moment I felt something shift between us, not a full reconciliation, not forgiveness wrapped in a bow, but the beginning of a different story where he finally saw me not as the absent parent, but as the constant force who had always been there, even when he refused to look. I didn't celebrate with a speech. I didn't demand gratitude. I simply said, "How about we celebrate by not pretending anymore?" And the look on his face told me that even if the road ahead would still be complicated, the illusion was broken. The lies had lost their power, and the terms of our future had finally been written by me.